then we'll start here. Hi everybody, this is Christopher Phillips, the founder and executive director of Democracy Cafe, Cafe Democracia, and this is our podcast, The Openist. And I'm here with the most open human being I've ever met in my life, Brother Cornel West.
My dear Brother Chris, what a blessing for me to be in the same space, man.
Brother West, I just came back from Democracy Cafe in Sacramento, where you're from.
Oh, Sacktown.
But there are so many homeless people.
Oh, I know.
And I keep asking myself, what happened to our sense of we are our brothers and sisters' keeper?
Yeah, but brother, we dealing with a spiritual collapse in terms of the generosity, integrity, honesty, and the sense of embracing others. It's a real spiritual blackout or whiteout, however you want to characterize it, and we got to keep fighting. You know, these are neo-fascist times, oh brother. These are times in which the rule of big money and big military and scapegoat the most vulnerable and demonize the vulnerable. These are very grim times, but we will bounce back.
Do you think so?
Do
you really?
Oh, no.
I mean, I'm an eternal optimist, but my wife and I, Ceci and I, give Classroom Without Walls to indigenous kids.
Yes.
And my 5-year-old Sibley, even they're not immune from social media. And she said, "Daddy, why do Americans hate Mexicans?" That's what she actually thinks, because of the president on down talking about the invasion and people crossing the border.
But see, a lot of that has to do with corporate media. It has to do with gangsters like Trump at the top who have high visibility. But there's a whole large slice of fellow citizens of Americans who don't hate Mexicans, who stand between that kind of hatred and the humanity of Mexicans, who create sanctuary cities, sanctuary institutions, sanctuary colleges. It's just that the folks who are forces for good have always had difficulty given the tremendous force of evil. This is not new. This is something that goes all the way back to our emergence from the caves. And so in that sense, just because the evil is more visible, it doesn't mean that somehow it is more mighty. It is mighty, but it's not almighty. And in that sense, the folk who decide to be forces of good should know, not that we'll triumph in the end. I don't want any of that kind of Hollywood happy ending thing. But the fact that we're still strong, fortified, determined to fight and go down swinging.
I do worry, though, that there is I almost am nostalgic for the polarization of the Clinton era. I worry that there is an absolutism on all sides. I think it's so easy to blame a Trump.
That's right.
But I worry about the absolutism that is creating this age of the other.
Yes. Well, in a way, as you know, it's not creating it, just making it more visible, just making it more salient, as it were. That see what has happened. There is a difference between a neoliberal regime and a neo-fascist regime. The neo-fascism is always much worse. That's what we're dealing with. So that the neoliberal regime under Clinton still had wealth inequality. You had a whole lot of hatred and contempt. You had a whole lot of arrogance, indifference, callousness. But it was hidden more readily. Now it's in one's face. It's raw. It's visceral. You see. And so we shouldn't in any way be overcome or overwhelmed. That's the most important thing. See, in a neo-fascist moment, on the rule of a Trump, for example, the last thing you want to do is ascribe magical powers to Trump, magical powers to the forces of callousness and indifference toward others. They are powerful, but it's not magical. They can be defeated, they can be contained, they can be circumscribed, they can be beat back. Now you can imagine, for me, being a black man in America, I'll go back to the 1950s. That's Jim Crow. 1920s. But you had, what is it, in 1919, man, you had like 56 vicious massacres against black people across the nation, the Klan, almost mayor of Detroit, and so forth and so on. So when you have that larger sense of memory and sense of history, you recognize, how do I get fortified? That's the crucial question. It's not how powerful Trump is or his social base or anything else.
So, it's interesting. I went to public school in Newport News, Virginia during the height of the desegregation era.
You were right there in Jim Crow America.
Yeah, but I mean, Got a horrible public school education, but I made some of the best black friends in the world I otherwise wouldn't have made.
There's some good folk down there, man, of all colors, some good people down there. But there, you see, the market hadn't penetrated the soul, hadn't penetrated the spheres of culture, so you still had certain kinds of decency and integrity people were holding on to. What has happened in the neoliberal era, where the marketization has taken over almost everything, university, church, science, government, it's harder to find people of integrity and honesty. It just is. Much more difficult.
But my daughter Callie, 12 years old now, remembers you vividly when you so kindly came and spoke to my students at Penn, and we broke bread with the community. She wanted me to ask you what's it like to live in an era of segregation, because she feels that there's a different kind of segregation happening now.
She's right. We can call it Jim Crow Jr.
Can we?
Oh, yeah, because when you look de facto segregation, New York City is more segregated now than it was in 1960.
Is it classism?
It's partly class, but it's also racial. They go hand in hand. The prism of class through race, the prism of race through class. So that for black middle-class folk, they get a distance. For black elites, they live in a different world. But for the black working poor and the black poor, it is worse. The segregation is worse, the schooling is worse, the housing is worse, and of course, the violence with the drugs coming in from the outside, the guns coming in from the outside.
I can't tell you how many people I've met who feel like they're almost enslaved. They have to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, and yet there's not that sense of empathy. How can we create a society, not a handout society, but a society to make sure everybody can contribute? And I see Mexico and the U.S., I see the boundaries as blurred, because I spend so much time in both. And I see the same sorts of problems, the racism, the classism there, in a very different manifestation, but the same deal.
But see, I think part of the problem, though, is we've got a relative political collapse of the ways in which elected officials, especially at the national level, represent the common good and public interest. We've got fellow citizens who are deeply empathetic and sympathetic and want to be in solidarity with poor and working people. You've got politicians, vast majority of whom are bought off by big money. And so they don't represent everyday people. That's why 43% of folk don't vote at all for most elections, and sometimes it's 55%. So what has happened is the political system has narrowed, absolutely right. They've narrowed it between neoliberal milquetoast Democrats, cold-hearted, mean-spirited Republicans, and now more and more neo-fascists, given the Trumpetization of the party. And so what happens is people completely distance themselves. They pull back. It doesn't mean that they're just less sympathetic. They just, the system is rigged. Let me see what I can do on my own. So the government policies are so cold-hearted. Look at what New York City's just done with Mayor Blasio, Mayor Bill Blasio. You know, calls himself a progressive. $3 billion corporate giveaway to the richest man in the world. And yet you take a subway ride in New York City and the place is collapsing. You see, that's what progressive politicians are. Can you imagine what the non-progressive politicians are like? They are demonizing the weak. And so in that sense, I think we should never confuse large numbers of everyday people with the cowardliness and the complicity of the elites to callousness and indifference.
You know, I don't confuse them, but there is a sense of impotence and resignation.
Oh, the helplessness is there.
So what can other ordinary folks, including me, what can we do to contribute in a way that makes sure everybody is elevated? I mean, what can we do within this framework of corporatism and so-called progressivism that really isn't?
One thing is that it's only by example. You see, the system specializes in producing fakes and phonies and frauds who act as if they're the real thing. What we need now in this moment, like Ashford and Simpson, Nicholas and Valerie, ain't nothing like the real thing. And the real thing, by example, is this is the kind of life I'm going to live. These are the kind of truths I'm going to tell. That's exactly what you have been doing down through the decades. You have a calling Be true to your calling, Brother Chris. You have a vocation. Be true to your vocation, Brother Chris. Love those around you. Fight for justice for those, especially the weak and vulnerable, who are part and parcel of not just your society, but of the world. No one of us are messiahs. There's no guarantee whatsoever that we will win, but we can win every day by trying to be an example of the real thing, and not being a copy, not a semblance, not a simulacra, but the real thing. That's what people are hungry for. That's what they're hungry for. But it's very difficult for such examples to actually pierce through.
But where does your social conscience come from? I mean, what is your earliest memory of standing up for the underdog? Where does it come from with you?
Well, you see, brother, I was a gangster about 5 years old, so I was beating folk up in order to take from those who had excessive amounts of food for lunch and some of my fellow students who had nothing to eat at all.
You were a pugilist.
So I started off in kindergarten, first grade,
Did you really?
7th grade. Oh, I did. I got kicked out of school when I was 7 years old. And I'm basically the same brother. You know, the child is the father of the man. I'm basically the same brother. I just got, read a few more books, gave a few more lectures. But it's true that when I met Jesus, it changed my life.
How old were you?
Because I was then about 7 and a half. And I had my mother, my father, I had Reverend Cook, and I had decided then I was going to be a Jesus-loving, free black man who spoke his mind, who was willing to sacrifice, to live and die for a kingdom. And we used to say in church all the time, the kingdom of God is within you, and everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. That's the fruits that you bear. Not the foliage, not what you look like, but the fruit that you bear, the relationships, the connections, the willingness to open yourself, be vulnerable. And of course, it's like black music, man. If you don't open yourself and give of yourself and empty yourself, then your sound is gonna be truncated.
All right, I'm gonna tell you something though.
Yeah.
I love Coltrane.
Oh yeah.
I love hip hop.
Yeah.
But when I read your works, and I've been reading it since Prophecy Delivered.
Ooh, that's 1982, brother.
I graduated from William & Mary in 81. You know what I think of? You know what I think of? I think of Shakespeare.
Oh.
You have a Shakespearean quality and cadence that I find inescapably true. And I'm just wondering, does that ever occur to you?
Well, yeah, not really.
And I think of Melville.
Melville,
I know,
my
but
God.
I still come back to you in Shakespeare.
I
don't know about that.
But yeah, with Shakespeare, he's the bard of the bards. I'm closer to this brother right here. The one and only.
But your delivery.
That's Curtis Mayfield right there.
Oh, man.
Oh, he's the Shakespeare on the guitar.
There you go.
Oh,
there
Lord.
You go.
But I appreciate it. I appreciate your words. But no, but part of it is, the thing about Shakespeare was
and you
that
think in colors.
His language was so rich, and the variety of characters that he displayed and depicted was so overwhelming, but you never really know what he himself thought. That he was able to hide and conceal the depths of his own convictions and beliefs. And I can appreciate that, being the kind of artist that he is, 39 plays and so forth. But for me, it's a matter of being quite explicit about almost vomiting it up all this rich love that I've received in my past. And it's a love of truth, a love of beauty, love of goodness, and as a Christian, a love of God. But it's always fallible. I always fall on my face. Try again, fail again, fail better. Samuel Beckett's right about that. Right. So in that sense, it's a matter of being much more upfront and vulnerable in the most risk-ridden sense, I think.
I think even what you wear has to do with the sort of sense of putting it on the line, being willing to risk your life for whatever, being ready for a funeral if that happens.
Well,
am I wrong about that?
Oh, no, you're right. I'm coffin ready. Absolutely. Brother Martin used to tell the folk all the time in the 60s. He would say, you better put your cemetery clothes on if you're going to be part of this movement. You get ready to die. But most importantly, it's also a matter of not allowing any of the world's idols to get in the way of your mission, your calling, and your conviction. So that if you just got the same thing on, you put on a uniform every day, you really don't have to worry too much about your clothes situation. Because it's just already there. It kicks in. You got other things you're focusing on.
You know, some years I travel over 200 days, and I have a 5-year-old and a 12-year-old. And I wonder sometimes, and you're a dad, And I wonder sometimes, can you be so busy trying to save the world that you forget about? You struggle with that? I do.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. No, in my own blessed family, it's always a matter of
So
trying
I've
to
tried
create
to,
some kind of balance.
yeah.
But you've done a magnificent job, man. You, both of y'all, put so much deep love into your gifts from heaven, though. But it's also a matter of you being true to your calling, because you can imagine that if you felt that you had in any way downplayed your calling and opted for anything else, you wouldn't be the same human being.
It's true, and yet I wonder, am I there enough? I'm always I was just in California. I went to public libraries throughout the state,
See,
holding these Democracy Cafe exchanges, because it's the great egalitarian bastion.
Absolutely.
But
absolutely.
I wonder, you've written Race Matters, Democracy Matters, and I think sometimes we need something about Child Matters.
Oh, that's what I wrote a book called The War Against Parents. The War Against Parents. Parenting being the ultimate non-market activity in a market-driven culture. So you don't have kids based on profit. You don't have kids based on making money. You better get ready for some deep joy and pain. At the same time, Frankie Beverly and Mays are right about that. They go together, right? But that joy that you have endures. It's different than the fleeting pleasures. And the pain you have with kids, too, it cuts deep. That's part of what it is to be human.
The very first work of yours that I read was The American Evasion of Philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
And the title alone, I come from a pragmatist tradition. My profs studied under Dewey, Sidney Hook. So I come from that tradition.
Oh, got Sidney Hook right there, out of step, his autobiography right there.
But
absolutely.
What struck me about your notion of prophetic pragmatism was that it's more relevant today, this idea that I feel like there's more false prophets than ever. People who cry peace, peace, when there is no peace.
Absolutely. It's always been, but now it even proliferates because you can actually make money doing that.
Coaches and the truisms and the platitudes.
Absolutely.
But I feel like with you people, you're not telling people to agree with you. You're saying let's think together and then let's act.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for me, I'm very old school about this, you know, Brother Chris, that the Socratic legacy of Athens speaks deep to my black soul.
You know I'm a Greek citizen.
Oh.
Yeah, look, I got my yaya taught me this. This is arete.
Look at that.
This is my wife. Wow. And this is meraki, to give soul and passion and to live a life of all-around excellence.
Arete.
But where duty to self and others goes hand in glove.
They go hand in glove.
You've got to have that social conscience that I feel like is lacking today.
Socrates that just has always moved me. I just lectured on him just a few weeks ago in a class. Every year I go back to him. Now, as you know, we've talked about Socrates never crying. Therefore, you got to move toward the legacy of Jerusalem and get to tears and always connect the tears with the critical analysis and the willingness to argue in public space and privately scrutinize oneself. So you never find yourself locked into a narrow dogma or doctrine. But it's true that pragmatism really is the best that the United States has been able to do to keep alive the Socratic legacy with the tears, with the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem. When those two come together, you can get a John Dewey with, of course, Ralph Waldo Emerson in the background and Whitman in the background, and the Du Bois being a contemporary, and you're on your way to the jazz musicians who probably enact pragmatism and democratic symbolic action more so than anybody we know in the American empire. And that's not to say that indigenous peoples and brown peoples and others don't have rich traditions, but I'm just talking about myself, that I have my own kind of narrowness, and it has much to do with Socratic legacy of Athens and the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem, which is dipped in the enslavement, the Jim Crow, the Jane Crow, the being hated and treated with contempt in the American empire to emerge with this deep love of truth and beauty and goodness.
Do your but the type of a prophet, many people think is somebody who foresees. I feel like you're saying this is how things are, and if we don't do X, Y, and Z, this is how things are going to turn out.
Absolutely. And in fact, the wonderful line in T.S. Eliot's essay on F.H. Bradley, where he says that wisdom is very much an attempt to keep alive the best. It's not an attempt to somehow foresee the triumph of the best. And even though he's right-wing, even though I have deep political disagreements with him, he's full of insight because he recognizes that tradition at its best, that's all we have. We've got the traditions of Martin King, the traditions of Fannie Lou Hamer, the traditions of Ida B. Wells, traditions of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel or Edward Said. We can go on and on. The traditions of Nikos Kalizakis with the Greeks and the modern Greeks and what have you. How do we keep those voices alive in the present such that we find our voices vis-a-vis the ways in which they found their voices?
Well,
that's where example comes in again.
I used to think that social media would help us disseminate these things, and I'm becoming more and more of a Luddite where I'm actually keeping social media at arm's length and thinking it's more important than ever face-to-face encounter.
We need both. We need both. We can never turn our backs on technology, and any form of new technology depends on the quality of the people who use it. To be addicted to technology is already a sign of a certain distance from your humanity.
I use this as an instrumental means.
Absolutely. Use it's a means toward a higher visionary end. Absolutely. On the other hand, it's also true that even before, we had the internet, you had the Holocaust, you had Stalin, you had European imperialism. I mean, we've had structural forms of evil that cut very deep, far before we've had technological innovations and breakthroughs, and we will after. The question is, how do we fortify ourselves in such a way that we can sustain the best of the past in a grim present?
My young Mexican friends and indigenous friends, you know where they know you from? The Matrix.
From the movie?
From the movie.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting.
They say, Cornel West. They go like this. What the heck? I said, yeah, I'm going to go see Cornel West. But it's interesting.
You send my love to them, though.
Oh, they want you to come down.
Oh, I do want to get down, too. I'd love to get down to Mexico.
Yeah, they were.
Good. But what is it like to be able to travel the world the way you do, though, man?
What's fascinating is to see the connections right now. I'm going to tell you something. You know where we're establishing a beachhead more than ever? Is in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Morocco, and they're being started by young women. My guests before you on this podcast were two young Saudi women who have started Socrates Cafe, Democracy Cafe at her university, and within her community. And my book is being translated into Arabic. If anybody had told me when this came out in 2001, that's all of a sudden, in very interesting times in the Arab world in Saudi Arabia, that a young women who just got the right to drive a couple months back, they have taken Socrates Cafe in directions that I never dreamed. And I'm wondering, they're putting it on the line.
That's beautiful, though, brother.
Would you have ever dreamed that in this time and climate that would be something?
Oh, no, I knew it was coming. You remember, even in Democracy Matters, in my chapter on Islamic identity.
I did. In fact, I just reread that.
Socratizing.
But a lot of people took umbrage with what you said.
Well, they should have, because they thought I was wrong. They got a right to be
Even
wrong
the New York Times
themselves.
slammed you.
Oh, they hit me hard because they thought I was being too naive about the capacity of Islam to undergo changes and transformations like any other great religious tradition. And you cannot suppress those voices within Islam that are talking about what the sanctity of persons made in the image of Allah. That's part and parcel of the tradition. I talked about prophetic, Islamic voices in that regard. But this is true for Judaism. It's true for Christianity. It's true for Buddhism, and so forth. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir's great text of 1949, The Second Sex, the centrality of individuality, freedom, ambiguity, and most importantly, in so many ways, the situation, the ways in which historical context will help change the tradition that has been bequeathed to us, and it's deeply patriarchal, deeply misogynist, just like it's true homophobic in regard to our precious gays and lesbians and trans folk, and of course deeply, deeply white supremacists as well. So the challenge for any great religious tradition, any great religion, is how can it be fundamentally renewed so that the best of what went into the religion is bequeathed to the younger generation. And there's no doubt that Islam is going to undergo some deep transformations, and it's a beautiful thing. And I say that as a fellow Christian.
Well, that's beautifully put. I remember, to me, race matters and democracy matters are of a piece.
That's true.
And
that's true.
They came out, both of them came out in the most critical times. You couldn't have possibly anticipated that, or could you?
Yeah, no, it's no way. No way. I mean, Race Matters was written in response to the Rodney King event, so you had the vicious attack on Brother Rodney by racist police. But Race Matters, I mean, democracy matters. When I talked about increasing authoritarianism, I talked about free market fundamentalism of the market, the marketization of the world, which is part of the gangsterization of the world, when the market has no accountability whatsoever to public interest. And then I also talked about the deep, spiritual challenge, the nihilism.
Nihilism.
That hits so deep. Meaninglessness, hopelessness, lovelessness, touchlessness, that has become so pervasive.
Now, I wonder sometimes, I haven't written a book now. I came out with 5, and then I feel like people ask me, when are you going to write your next one? I say, well, I just don't feel like this is the time to be writing.
I'm with you. I've been trying to finish my book on Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel now.
I came to your class.
7. Yeah, that's
right.
You were there.
Institute. Yeah, I sure did. I
follow
you.
Right.
I am your ultimate groupie. I know other people follow you, but I go to your classes.
No, we've had some good times together, though, brother. We've had some good times. But no, the Heschel book is going to get done. It really
all right,
is.
But let's say we never write another book again. Is it okay? I mean, what you've done with American Invasion of Philosophy, Race Matters, Democracy. I just feel like now's the time to be out on the street, almost in the trenches. I know we can say that that's true in many eras and epochs, but I dare say now more than ever. Or is that an
the thing
overstatement?
is, no, I think we always need clarity. We always need some analysis, some diagnosis of our situation, to use a category of Beauvoir. And so any text you have written, any text you will write, provides a certain clarity. And the stories, the narratives, the arguments, the visions that we put forward. But it's also true that we need examples, concrete bodies in the street, going to jail, trying to exemplify and embody the kinds of virtues that we talk about.
No, every time I see you in the front lines, I mean, getting arrested, I think this is where we need to be right now, and there will be time for analysis and everything else if we do get through this time.
Well, no, that's real. But you can still get through some analysis after you go to jail. You can just take some time, get out of that cell, steal away, do your reading, go right back in again. It's back and forth.
Right. How can anybody ever feel sorry for himself after what Nelson Mandela went through for decades?
True, 27 and a half years. Man.
Yeah, I held dialogues in Soweto. You know what? They know the Socratic tradition. I would just hold these spontaneous dialogues. They wouldn't call it Socratic. They sit in circles. They go, no, you can't just say what you think. You have to say why you think what you think.
That's
and
it.
they also feel like everybody has to participate.
That's beautiful. That's accountability, answerability. That is Socratic to the core. We see it in Mexico. And, of course, in Chiapas, you've got the social movement serving as a backdrop. So it's not just the utterance, but it's also the bodies on the line.
Well, these are interesting times in Mexico because Andrés Manuel López Obrador is fairly pragmatic, progressive. He's going to be taking office December 1st. He's going to be taking office,
absolutely.
But he's also got a really big, healthy ego like Trump. So I wonder what's going to happen.
That's going to be interesting. He's going. I hope Trump meets his match with him. Then you got the reactionary in Brazil taking over.
It's interesting times.
Do
you ever think of running for office, or is that not your deal?
No, I don't think that's my call. I mean, I'm open to any kind of use of the call.
Surely I'm not the first to ask you that.
Calling.
You really don't?
No, I don't think so. I think if I could just try to tell whatever truths I can get out.
I know, but I think there's people who would totally disagree with you, but would vote for you because of you have an intellectual honesty and integrity that I think is just so lacking. My friends who are Obama acolytes, they get so mad at me. I say, no, he's just branded really well.
I know.
They get mad at me. But I think, what I want is somebody who has the virtues, regardless of what their specific political stances are.
I'm with you. I mean, if you have courage, fortitude, generosity, a willingness to serve, and most importantly, the sense of wanting to be honest and candid. You can't just look for cover. As we know, that was a challenge of the Obama years. You see, everybody wanted to protect him so he could have 5 wars going on. He could have drones dropped on innocent children. He could kill American citizens, have them assassinated without due process, and still say he's a man of peace and a man of rule of law. He could be tied to Wall Street and still claim the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. He could have national security expanded. He could have surveillance expanded and punish whistleblowers and still be this defender of liberty. You can't have it both ways. But people were living in symbolic terrains. It's true. His being president was a great symbolic indictment of white supremacy. We ought to hate white supremacy like any other evil. But it's symbolic. It was not substantial. So you got a Black Lives Movement under a black president. They let you know. Down here on the ground, we're catching hell. Up there in the symbolic realms, he's making history. Well, you had to have somebody to say, look, we want to know what is the gap between the utterances and the praxis. So you got to deal with capitalism. You got to deal with imperialism. You got to deal with white supremacy, male supremacy, homophobia, and so forth. And that was the unwillingness of so many of our fellow liberals and fellow progressives to do. And there is a sense in which, the neo-fascist backlash, the white supremacist backlash, the misogynist backlash against what was perceived to be this progressivism was actually helped set in place by the dishonesty of the neoliberals.
But then another way I get slammed is look at Hillary. She's ultra hawkish. Her policies as Senator and Secretary of State decimated emerging democracies in Honduras. And yet that seems to not get any play at all. I mean, all these innocents who were coming from Honduras to hear, if U.S. policy wasn't this spending billions on the war against drugs, which is never going to solve anything, and was really to build a strong economy back home,
that's right.
And actually opposing emerging democratic leaders like they did there, then they wouldn't have to risk life and limb with their children.
That's right. I mean, the support of the military coup in Honduras under both Clinton and Obama was just downright disgusting. No serious critique among the liberals. But the same is true in terms of their relation with Saudi Arabian elites.
How can we make pervasive that Socratic sensibility of challenging our elected officials? Because Greece's great decline came when we suddenly put things in the hands of the experts and quit looking at ourselves in the mirror and say, what do we ordinary citizens need to be enlightened generalists who give the marching orders to these people? And I'm wondering if there's any way to come full circle.
But that's exactly what you represent, though, brother. You represent Socratic forces for good among everyday people at the grassroots level to create cultures of truth-telling, cultures of courageous witness, cultures of mature hope, not that kind of Hollywood-driven optimism, but the mature hope. And hope these days is not about talking about hope. Hope's about being a hope. You are a hope in what you do. You are a hope in the service that you render. You are a hope in the conversations that you help facilitate all around the world. So you don't even need a discourse of hope. The last thing we need is for a discourse of hope to again get colonized by neoliberal politics or some marketing strategy of a firm that dangles this hope. And it's about as weak as pre-sweetened Kool-Aid, in the language of my dear brother Ren Brown. And so in that sense, I salute you, though, brother. And I know I'm going to have to let you go, but may I tell you this? It's a blessing to look in your eyes, man, because you're an inspiration.
Thank you. Thanks for the gift of your time, as always.
Man. Oh, indeed. I wish we had another 2 hours. I know I'm running late, but I'm never late being with you, though, man. Love you, though, brother.
I love you, too.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Indeed. Lord. And I hope we got enough. I don't know how long we